What would happen if one day you discovered that your life was not what you always believed it to be? If the family you loved for so many years was not truly where you belonged? There are secrets buried beneath the ocean. There are painful choices that cannot be undone, and there are loves so great that they transcend right and wrong. Let the wind guide us, a story of loss, love, and the decisions that can change an entire life. But before we begin, help Moonlitwest reach its first 159 subscribers. Just one click to like and subscribe, and you'll be fueling us to tell even more heartfelt stories. Now, take a deep breath, clear your mind, and let the wind carry us into the tale. The sound of waves crashing against the rocky shore never ceased. They surged, withdrew, and returned again, like the steady breath of something eternal on Wren's Hollow, a quiet island off the coast of Maine. That rhythm was the only constant. There were no bustling roads, no shimmering city lights, no late-night chatter at bars, just the gray sky, the old lighthouse, and the endless expanse of the ocean. Nate Calloway had never truly imagined spending his life on an isolated island, but perhaps this was the only place he could endure. After the war, he had tried to return to normal life, the cobblestone streets, the men laughing over Sunday morning coffee, the letters from friends inquiring about the future, but nothing ever quite fit anymore. The echoes of gunfire still rang in his head, and sleepless nights continued to haunt him. So when the opportunity came to take over the old rescue station on Wren's Hollow, he didn't hesitate. A place with no people, no memories, no reminders of the past. Ellie followed him. She had always been the kind of person who could find light in the bleakest places. When Nate was drowning in nightmares, it was Ellie who pulled him back, holding his hand tight in the dead of night, whispering soft words as if her grip alone could keep him from drifting away. She wasn't afraid of isolation. On the contrary, she embraced it as salvation. The city only reminded her of what she could never have: women walking hand in hand with their children, families filled with laughter, from which she would always remain an outsider. They arrived on the island in late autumn, when the air had turned crisp and the seagulls circled in wide arcs above the sky. The lighthouse keeper's cottage was old, its wooden floors groaning with every step, but Ellie loved it immediately. "I think we can fix this place up," she said, the first time she stepped inside, wrapping her wool scarf tightly around her neck. Nate stood behind her, surveying the empty room: cracked walls, salt-streaked windows, water stains that proved the rainy season had not been kind to this place. "Don't you think it's a little worn down?" he asked, trying to mask his skepticism. Ellie only smiled, her brown eyes glimmering in the dim light. "Just a little. but it can be fixed. She always believed everything could be repaired, and so they began their new life. The first few days passed slowly. Nate spent most of his time inspecting the lighthouse, making sure it was still functional for passing ships. The work wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him occupied. Ellie tended to the house, planting patches of wildflowers around the yard, trying to turn this place into something that felt more like home than an old rescue station. They loved each other. That had never changed, but no matter how hard they tried, there were spaces between them that nothing could fill. Sometimes, on nights when the moon shone bright, Ellie would stand on the porch, clutching an old knitted sweater that was meant for the child they never had. She never spoke of it, but Nate knew. He knew what she was thinking, what she was imagining. A child running barefoot through the yard, laughing as they chased the gulls, tiny fingers clinging to hers when the wind grew too cold. But they had no such child, and the silence of Wren's Hollow only made that fact more painfully clear. Do you ever wonder if we were wrong to come here? Ellie asked one night, her voice thin as thread, as if speaking louder would cause something to unravel. Nate gazed out at the sea where the waves continued their endless assault on the shore. He thought of the sleepless nights, the cold sweat running down his back, the memories he could never escape. "No," he said. "I think we belong here." Ellie said nothing. Maybe Nate was right, but there was something inside her that still longed for more, something she couldn't name, something the sea had yet to bring her. And then, on a stormy night, the sea delivered a child to them. The wind howled through the cracks of their home, rattling the windows, as if invisible hands were trying to force their way inside. Above, the sky churned with thick clouds, swallowing the moonlight and plunging the island into an ink-black abyss. Towering waves battered the rocky cliffs, roaring like an enraged beast. Nate pulled his coat tighter around him, standing on the porch, eyes scanning the sea. He had seen many storms during his time in the military, yet he could never grow used to nature's raw fury. This was the kind of storm that left nothing unscathed. It could uproot trees, sink ships, and wash away anything too fragile to withstand it. Behind him, Ellie curled up on the chair, wrapped in a woolen blanket, her wide eyes fixed on the trembling window panes. She said nothing, only clasped her hands together as if trying to steady their shaking. The rain lashed against the roof, 100,000 pebbles hurled down from the heavens. The waves, crowned with white froth, crashed against the cliffs, their foam dissolving into the darkness. They had endured storms before, but this time, something was different. Nate could feel it in the air, a strange premonition running down his spine, as if something was about to change forever. The storm raged on through the night. By morning, the sky was a dull gray, and the sea had begun to calm, but the traces of its fury remained, broken branches scattered across the ground, rainwater pooling in muddy patches, and the weary waves still lapping at the shore, as if the ocean had yet to fully regain its composure. Nate stepped outside, his boots sinking into the damp earth. He needed to check the shoreline to make sure nothing dangerous had washed up. Planks from a wrecked ship, sharp debris that could be carried in by the tides. But as he approached the northern beach, something made him stop, dead in his tracks. There, near the water's edge, was a small overturned boat, one side smashed in as if it had crashed against the rocks, and beside it, a motionless body. Nate's heart pounded as he sprinted forward. A man lay face down in the sand, his soaked shirt clinging to his back, his pale skin stretched tight, his hands clenched as if he had been grasping for something before the waves took him. Nate dropped to his knees, turning the man over, but he knew instantly it was too late. Vacant eyes stared up at the gray sky, his breath long gone. Nate clenched his jaw. He had seen death before, but he never got used to the way it felt. The man had likely died hours ago, perhaps just as the storm had begun to subside. He was about to stand and head back to tell Ellie when a sound, faint, broken, a cry. Nate froze. He turned sharply, his pulse hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. Inside the overturned boat, something moved. A small bundle of gray fabric shifted ever so slightly, and then the sound came again, a soft, gasping sob, fragile as a dying flame. Nate bent down, his hands shaking as he pulled the fabric aside, and there, amid the salty brine of the ocean, was a newborn child. Ellie nearly collapsed when Nate carried the baby inside. She couldn't find her voice as she stared at the tiny being in his arms, a baby boy, no older than 4 or 5 months, his deep blue eyes still glistening with tears, his pale skin cold to the touch. His tiny lips quivered, his breath ragged from too much crying. Nate placed him on the table, rubbing his small hands to generate warmth. Ellie rushed forward, her fingers trembling as she removed the soaked blanket, searching for any trace of lingering warmth. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He's alive." She quickly wrapped him in a dry towel, pulling him close to her chest. The baby curled into her instinctively, pressing his face against her as if some primal sense told him this was the safest place to be. Ellie's entire body trembled as she held him tight, gently patting his back, whispering soft words of comfort. Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling onto the child's rosy cheeks. Nate stood behind her, watching his wife, with something heavy lodged in his throat. He had never seen Ellie like this. Her whole being radiated a gentle light, a love so profound that he knew she had carried it in her heart for years. He wanted to say something, but he couldn't. Ellie looked up, her brown eyes shimmering. "Nate," she whispered, This is a miracle." He swallowed hard. Ellie had never believed in miracles, but in this moment, he could see it clearly in her eyes. This child was the very thing she had been praying for. He wanted to protest, to say that no one knew who this baby belonged to remind her that they couldn't just keep a child that wasn't theirs. But as he watched the baby drift into sleep in Ellie's arms, he knew he wouldn't say those words. And just like that, in a single moment, their fate was sealed forever. They named the baby Samuel Sam Calloway. Ellie said the sea had brought him to them, and perhaps it had taken everything he once had. Nate said nothing because deep down he knew the truth could never stay buried forever. Sam's laughter echoed across the vastness of the island, blending into the rhythmic song of the waves against the shore. He was 4 years old now, as quick and nimble as a seabird, his bare feet kicking up sand as he ran, his tiny arms stretching toward the sky as if he wanted to embrace the endless ocean. His bright blue eyes sparkled under the morning sun, his golden hair tousled by the wind, and on his small, round face was a smile so pure, so full of joy, untouched by sorrow. Ellie stood on the porch, her hand resting against the doorframe, watching him with boundless love in her eyes. Sam was the greatest gift the sea had ever given her. He was everything she had ever longed for, a child, a missing piece that had finally filled the emptiness in her heart. Her sleepless nights were no longer haunted by silence, but by soft, comforting sounds, the quiet rhythm of Sam's breathing as he slept, the sweet giggles that escaped his lips when he dreamed of something funny. She had taught him his first words, watched him take his first wobbly steps across the old wooden floors of their home, and now he was a curious, lively boy, always running, always exploring, his heart wide open to the world. Nate loved Sam too. There was no denying that. In the early days, he kept a silent distance, a nameless fear pressing against his chest, but over time, the boy became an inseparable part of his life. Every morning, Sam would sneak into their bed, crawl between them, and whisper, "Wake up, Dad, it's morning," then burst into laughter when Nate pretended to pull the blanket over his head. At first, Sam called them Nate and Ellie, but one day, while playing on the beach with small stones, he absent-mindedly called Nate Dad. Nate froze. Ellie's body tensed, ever so slightly, her eyes flickering with overwhelming emotion, but she said nothing. Nate didn't correct him either. He had known this day would come. Sam had grown accustomed to this life, to Ellie's embrace, to bedtime stories, to Nate's strong hands, lifting him high into the air and spinning him around until he laughed as if he were flying. From that day forward, Sam was their son, but Nate never stopped thinking about the truth. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when Ellie and Sam were fast asleep, Nate would sit alone on the porch, staring out at the sea. The waves never stopped, just like the thoughts in his mind. He always wondered Was someone out there, waiting? Was there a mother somewhere, still searching, still wondering where her child had drifted? Was there someone desperately praying, hoping for a miracle to bring her son home? He had kept these thoughts buried for years, but they grew stronger, swelling inside him like a tide that could not be held back. And then one day, the sea decided to return the truth. That morning, the sky was clear and the ocean was so still that Nate could see straight to the bottom. He was repairing the old boat, the very boat they had found that fateful day in the storm that had brought Sam into their lives. The boat lay tilted on the sand, its wooden hull worn down by time and salt. But something inside him urged him to turn over every plank to search for any remnants of the past. And then he found it, tucked inside the rotting fabric of an old coat. Draped over the boat's edge was a scrap of paper, weathered by wind and seawater, barely holding together. His fingers trembled as he unfolded it. The hurried scrawl, the ink smudged, but still legible, read, "If someone finds this letter, please let's bring my son home. His name is Jacob Ellis. I am his mother. I lost my husband. I cannot lose my son. Please." It felt like ice water had been poured over him. The paper shook between his fingers. He read the words again and again, and his heart pounded so hard it ached in his chest. Jacob, not Sam. Margaret Ellis, not Ellie Calloway. The truth crashed over him like a wave, sweeping away everything he had tried to forget for the past 4 years. Sam, or rather, Jacob, did not belong to them. He had a mother who was still waiting. His entire body felt impossibly heavy, as if every bone inside him was collapsing under the weight of this truth. Somewhere on the mainland, there was a woman who had lost everything, who perhaps still woke up every day hoping for a miracle, hoping someone would knock on her door and tell her that her son was alive. And yet, he had kept Sam for himself. He had chosen silence. He had let Ellie believe that the sea had given Sam to them. But the truth was, the sea did not give. The sea only took, and one day it would take everything back. The wind picked up as the supply boat reached the shore. Once a month, a small vessel from the mainland docked at Wren's Hollow, bringing supplies, letters, and sometimes bits of news from the outside world. But to Nate and Ellie, these visits were like a breeze across the surface of the water, there for a moment, then gone, leaving the island as isolated as ever. This morning, Nate stood on the beach, his bare feet sinking into the cold sand, watching the small boat glide toward the shore. The ocean was calm, but inside him, a storm was brewing. From the moment he had found the letter inside that tattered coat, his heart had not known peace. The words were etched into his mind like a curse. He could not erase Jacob Ellis. I am his mother. I lost my husband. I cannot lose my son. And now, the sea no longer held that secret alone. When the captain and his crew stepped off, Nate helped them unload the cargo, as he always did. Sacks of flour, crates of salted fish, oil for the lanterns. One by one, they were placed onto the sand. There was no hurry. There never was. "How are things on the mainland?" Nate asked absently, as he always did. The captain, a grizzled man with salt and pepper hair and hands worn rough from years at sea, gestured toward the old newspapers they had brought with them. "It's the same as always. The war has been over for years, but its scars remain. In Boston, there's a woman still searching for her son, a boy who went missing in a storm a few years ago. It's a tragic story." Nate felt his chest tighten. He didn't want to ask, but he had to. "Who?" The man shook his head, his voice dropping low. "Margaret Ellis. Her husband died in the storm, and her little boy was never found, but she never gave up." Nate stood still. The waves lapped at his feet, ice cold. He didn't need to hear anything else. He already knew. That night, after Sam had fallen into a deep sleep, Ellie stood in the kitchen, gently drying the ceramic dishes. She did this every evening, a quiet ritual to bring order, not just to their home, but to her heart. Nate watched her for a long time, watched the loose tie of her long brown hair, the warmth in her eyes whenever she gazed at their sleeping son, watched the way she cherished even the smallest things, as if everything in her life had to be carefully preserved because she knew what it was to lose. His throat felt dry. "Ellie," he said. She turned, her expression soft. "What is it?" He didn't know where to begin. There was no way to say this without breaking her. Nate stepped closer, taking her hand in his. Ellie's hand was small in his, warm and familiar, as if she had always been there, as if they had belonged to each other forever. But some things, not even love, could change. "We can't keep Sam." Ellie froze. The cloth in her hand slipped onto the table, soundless. The kitchen fell so silent that Nate could hear her breathing, quick, trembling. She shook her head almost instantly. "No, Nate, don't do this." "I have to." His voice was quiet, but heavy. "I know the truth. I've kept this secret for too long." Ellie took a step back, as if putting distance between them could protect her from what he was about to say. "He's our son," she whispered. "Sam is not our son, Ellie." Nate held her gaze, trying to steady himself, though inside he felt like he was unraveling. "He has a mother out there, Margaret Ellis. She never stopped looking for him." Ellie clenched her fists, her knuckles turning white. "She may be his biological mother," her voice broke, "but Sam doesn't know her. He only knows us." Nate closed his eyes because he knew that Sam had grown up in their arms. He called them Mom and Dad. To Sam, they were the only family he had ever known, but the truth was still the truth. "Ellie," he said, his voice raw, "if you lost your child, could you live your whole life without searching for them? Her lips trembled. "I don't care," she whispered. "I don't care about anyone but Sam." "But I care," Nate said. "I care about doing the right thing." A single tear slid down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. "Nate," she pleaded, "if you do this, I will lose everything." The words cut through him like a knife. He loved her enough that if he could, he would shut his eyes to the truth, let it sink beneath the sand, let them live in this lie forever. But if he did that, he would never be able to look Sam in the eyes again. And one day, when Sam grew up and learned the truth, would he still call them Mom and Dad? "Ellie," Nate whispered, "we have to return him to where he belongs." Ellie sank onto the chair, her hands gripping the table, as if it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. But Nate couldn't turn back now. The next morning, just as the sun broke the horizon, he sat down, picked up a pen, and wrote, "To Margaret Ellis, I don't know where to begin, but I know your son is alive, and I know it's time to bring him home." That morning, the wind blew stronger than usual. The waves crashed against the rocks with a low, echoing force, an omen of what was to come. Ellie stood on the porch, her hands clenched together, her eyes locked on the small boat, making its way toward the island. The wind whipped through her long brown hair, but she didn't care. Her heart pounded so hard, she could hear it in her chest. Margaret Ellis, that name, had haunted her ever since Nate sent the letter. Ellie had spent countless sleepless nights trying to picture the woman, a mother who had lost her child, someone she should have felt compassion for, yet couldn't help but fear, because Margaret wasn't just coming to find her son, she was coming to take Sam away. The boat's engine slowed as it reached the small wooden dock. Nate stood by the shore, his shoulders tense, his hands clenched together, as if he himself wasn't ready for this. Margaret stepped off. She was smaller than Ellie had imagined, a woman with dark hair pulled into a tight bun, her face pale with anxiety and emotion, her eyes deep wells of loss. As she stepped onto the island, Margaret paused, as if needing a moment to steady her breath, and then her gaze locked onto the little boy, playing not far away, Sam. He ran barefoot across the sand, his golden hair glinting under the morning sun. He laughed as he tossed a small rock into the sea, then turned back to look for Ellie, and then he saw the stranger. Sam stopped. He stared at Margaret with curiosity, not fear, but no sign of recognition either. Margaret's heart shattered. She had imagined this moment hundreds, thousands of times. She had once believed that if a miracle happened, if she ever found her son, he would run into her arms, his tiny hands clutching onto her as if they had never been apart. But Sam didn't do that. He only stood there, his bright blue eyes reflecting the sunlight, waiting for an introduction. Ellie stepped down from the porch, her heart pounding so hard It felt like it would break free from her chest. She knew there was nothing she could do to change what was about to happen, but when she saw the look in Margaret's eyes, so full of love, so full of grief, she felt as though she was standing at the edge of another storm. She knelt down, gently placing a hand on her son's shoulder. "Sam, this is Miss Margaret," she said, her voice catching. Sam glanced at Margaret, then back at Ellie. He didn't understand why the adults looked so strange today, why there was something heavy and unspoken hanging in the air. Then instinctively, he leaned into Ellie, his small fingers clutched at the fabric of her dress. "Sam," Ellie whispered, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Say hello to Miss Margaret." Sam obediently repeated, "Hello, Miss Margaret." His voice was clear, innocent, but to Margaret, it was a blade to the heart. Her son, her flesh and blood, the child she had spent 4 years searching for, the child she had cried for until she had no more tears left to shed. And yet, here he was, standing before her, not knowing who she was. A tear slipped down Margaret's cheek. Nate stepped forward, resting a gentle hand on her shoulder, a quiet gesture of comfort. "Would you like to come inside?" he asked. Margaret swallowed hard, forcing the lump in her throat down, then nodded. The small house was so quiet that the ticking of the clock felt deafening. Ellie poured tea into a cup, but her hands were trembling so much that a few drops spilled over the rim. Sam sat beside her, his little legs swinging beneath the chair, occasionally glancing at Margaret with curiosity. Margaret couldn't take her eyes off him. Sam looked so much like her husband. Those blue eyes, the shape of his face. He was an exact replica of the man she had lost. That stormy night, looking at Sam, she could see everything that should have been hers. But now, how could she take him back? She saw the way Sam leaned into Ellie, the way he tilted his head when she rubbed his back, the way his small fingers reached for her hand when he felt unsure. This wasn't just a lost child. This was a child who had found another family. She could take him back. She had every right to. But if she did, how would Sam react? A 4-year-old boy who had only ever known one mother. How could he possibly understand why a stranger wanted to take him away? Margaret closed her eyes, her chest tightening as if someone had placed a heavy stone inside it. She had prayed for this moment every night for 4 years, and now that it was here, she didn't know what to do. When she opened her eyes, Ellie was looking at her. Ellie's eyes weren't filled with hatred. They weren't selfish. They only held a quiet, aching sorrow, a fear that the one thing she loved most in the world was about to be taken away. And in that moment, Margaret understood. Ellie was Sam's mother, too, whether she wanted to accept it or not, whether they were connected by blood or not. Ellie had raised him, had loved him with all her heart. If she took Sam away now, she wouldn't just hurt Ellie. She would be hurting her own son. The room remained silent. Then, in a voice as light as a breath, Margaret spoke. "You're such a wonderful boy," she said, her voice trembling. "Do you like living here, Sam?" Sam nodded immediately. "I love the sea, and Mom Ellie makes the best cakes." Margaret smiled, but her heart ached so much she could barely stand it. She couldn't do this. She couldn't make her son afraid, couldn't tear his world apart, just to satisfy her own longing. A true mother wasn't the one who claimed her child. She was the one who put him first, even when it broke her. So Margaret reached out, gently brushing her fingers through Sam's hair. He didn't pull away. Margaret swallowed back tears, then whispered, "If you'd like, you can call me Aunt Margaret." Ellie covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks, and beside her, Nate closed his eyes and took a deep breath, like a storm had just left the island. The years passed, like waves gently rolling onto shore, leaving their marks in the sand before retreating to make way for others. Sam grew up, surrounded by two loves, two mothers, two lives, but only one heart. Margaret never disappeared. She didn't take Sam away, but she also didn't let him grow up without knowing his birth mother's love. She visited the island whenever she could, bringing little gifts from the mainland, books, trinkets, and stories about the world beyond the sea. At first, Sam didn't understand why Aunt Margaret loved him so much. She always looked at him with such tenderness, sometimes with a quiet sadness. He didn't quite grasp, but he never asked. To him, she was like a fairy godmother, someone who, though she didn't live on the island, always appeared so just when he needed her. But the person he loved most had always been Ellie. Ellie was the mother who sang him to sleep with soft lullabies, the one who held him tight after nightmares, the one who ran to him when he tripped, kissed his scrapes, and whispered, "It's okay, Mommy's here." And Nate was no less a father. He taught Sam how to steer a boat, how to read the wind, how to listen to the sea as if it were telling a story. The ocean is never truly silent, son. You just have to learn how to listen. Sam grew up as much a part of the island as the waves themselves. But no matter how peaceful life was, no matter how much love surrounded him, there was one truth no one dared to face. And when he turned 18, it was finally time. That night, the sea was as still as glass. The waves rolled in soft, rhythmic pulses, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. Sam sat on the porch, his long legs stretched over the worn wooden steps, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. Summer had arrived, bringing with it the scent of salt and wild grass carried in on the breeze. Ellie and Nate stepped outside, moving slowly as if each step was heavier than the last. Sam turned, smiling faintly. "Why do you guys look so serious?" Ellie sat beside him, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them over his. "Sam," she began, her voice quiet, "there's something we should have told you a long time ago. His brow furrowed. What is it? Nate took a deep breath. Sam, you weren't born on this island. The world seemed to pause. Sam sat up straighter, his eyes darting between them. What do you mean? Ellie bit her lip, struggling to keep her emotions in check. We never told you because we didn't want to hurt you. The boy they had raised and loved for 18 years now stared at them, his eyes full of confusion. What are you trying to say? Ellie inhaled deeply. You're not our biological son. Sam's chest tightened. He said nothing, no reaction, just sat there, waiting for something inside him to break. You came to us after a storm, Nate continued, his voice as low as the whispering wind through the trees. We found you on a boat that washed ashore. You were just a few months old. Sam swallowed hard. Then who are my parents? Ellie gripped his hand tightly. Your mother, your biological mother, is Margaret Ellis. Sam froze. He thought of her. Aunt Margaret, the woman he had known all his life, the one who always looked at him with something unspoken in her eyes. And now he understood. Aunt Margaret, his voice was barely above a whisper. She's my real mother? Ellie nodded, tears finally spilling over. She never abandoned you, Nate said, his gaze steady. She lost her husband in the storm and thought she had lost you too, but she never stopped searching for you. Sam didn't know what to feel. He looked down at his hands, feeling as if his entire world had just been turned upside down. He was still himself, but at the same time, he wasn't. He wasn't angry. He didn't blame anyone, but he felt as though he had lost something, though he couldn't even name what it was. A cool breeze swept past him, and suddenly, Sam realized the most important thing of all. No matter what the truth was, the love he had received had never been a lie. He lifted his head, meeting Ellie's tear-filled eyes. Mom, he said, his voice trembling. You're still my mom, right? Ellie broke down, pulling her son into her arms. Of course, Sam, she whispered, always. And when he turned to Nate, the man who had taught him how to sail, how to live with the sea, how to be strong, he asked only one question. Dad, Nate smiled, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. I'll always be your dad, son. And at last, Sam understood. Family wasn't defined by blood or legal documents. Family was made of the people who had loved him through everything. That night, Sam walked to the shore. He stood there, letting the waves brush against his bare feet, gazing up at the star-filled sky. He remembered it all, his childhood, playing in the sand, the nights spent gathered around the fireplace, Ellie's warm embraces, Nate's lessons, the way Margaret had always looked at him with such deep, quiet love. He had lost a family, but he had also gained one. And now, standing between these two oceans of love, he could only whisper one thing. Thank you for bringing me here. As the wind swept past, Sam closed his eyes and let it carry him forward toward the future where he didn't belong to just one person, but to all of them. Thank you for listening to today's story on Moonlitwest. Every story we tell isn't just meant to stir emotions, but to leave behind something deeper, thoughts on love, fate, and the choices that shape our lives. If you enjoyed this story, please support the channel by liking, subscribing, and helping Moonlitwest reach its first 99 subscribers. Stay with us as we continue exploring more heartfelt stories together, wishing you a peaceful night, beautiful dreams, and see you in the next story. Good night.